Hello, welcome on this MA course East meets West Connections and Convergencies in Cold War and Post-Cold War Europe. My name is Machteld Venke. I'm a professor of contemporary transnational history at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History of the University of Luxembourg. Our guest lecturer today is Victor Fernandez Soriano, and the title of his guest lecture is Human Rights, European Integration and Southern Dictatorships, 1949-1977. Dr. Victor Fernandez Soriano connects three historical processes: the emergence of international human rights after the Second World War, European integration, and dictatorial four-wing rule in Greece, Spain, and Portugal. The main argument is that the participation of southern dictatorships to European integration organizations challenges the official historical narrative that links European integration to human rights. Pedagogically, he dwells on the meaning of human rights and on the role of Southern Europe in the Cold War relations. The timeline discussed in the lecture goes from 1949, which is the foundation of the Council of Europe and NATO, until 1977, the European Commission Declaration on Fundamental Rights, and the beginning of negotiations for accession. It is important to keep this development in mind while evaluating the path of inclusion of Central and Eastern European countries into European institutions later. As Emma de Angelis and Eirini Karamouzi argued in their article titled Enlargement and the Historical Origins of the European Community's Democratic Identity, 1961-1978. And here is a quote: as countries in Central and Eastern Europe also started on the path to democratic transition, their demands for the community's support had much to do with the seeds that had been sown in the 1960s and 1970s. Dr. Victor Fernandez Soriano is a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and ESPOL in Lille in France. Previously, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History in Luxembourg, where he worked on the global history of human rights, European integration, and Southern Europe. Soriano is the author of the book Le fusil et l'olivier, les droits de l'homme en Europe face aux dictatures méditerranéennes, which was published in Brussels in 2015.
So, let me explain you what we're going to deal with in this lecture. And first of all, the title of the lecture is already quite indicative of its contents: Human Rights, European Integration and Southern Dictatorship 1949-1977. The aim of this lecture is indeed to delve into the interconnection of these three elements: human rights, European integration, and dictatorial rule in Southern Europe, and this for the timeline 1949-1977. Why? Because we may find in this historical context, in this interconnection, the origins of the European Union's concern on human rights abroad, as well as the historical origins of enlargement to the European Union as a means to promote democracy and human rights. So, this is a historical process that connects in some way the South and the East. The South represents the first chapter of the historical process, especially in the 1970s, whereas the East represents the second chapter, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s. In other words, next we're going to talk about how the West met the South. In a nutshell, this lecture dwells on how the process of European integration faced, tackled, and dealt with dictatorial rule in Southern Europe, with the non-communist, far-right, authoritarian dictatorships that existed in Southern Europe during this period. And we'll argue that the European relations with these dictatorships set the basis for human rights compliance as a condition to be a member of the European community, and further to participate into European integration. So, for a better understanding, what I propose you to do now is to focus on each single element so that I can develop and explain them to you with the intention of setting the general context of what we're going to expose next. So, to begin with, let's talk about human rights. Human rights can be defined as the inalienable rights that are inherent to the human condition. They are the rights that every individual holds because of the fact of being a human. Human rights have been present in the constitutional tradition of several parliamentary democracies such as France or the United States for decades, even for centuries, especially since the late years of the 18th century, of the revolutionary processes that happened during that period, even though in this context they were limited for a long time to white male populations. After World War II, the idea came up to grant recognition to these rights in international law too, since these rights were deemed to be universal, so it seemed logic that after the events of World War II, after the catastrophes and human destruction brought about by World War II, that a new framework for international human rights was fostered. And so, the United Nations created a Commission on Human Rights in 1946 and ordered the drafting of a declaration to a committee of experts chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman in the picture who was at the time the widow of the former US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was issued. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, a very influential text ever since, approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948. If you want to read further on this historical process, I recommend you to read Mark Mazauer's book No Enchanted Palace. Nevertheless, the Universal Declaration was conceived as a non-binding text with no legal further power. In order to set the ground for a binding covenant on human rights at a regional level, some months after the issue of the Universal Declaration, a committee was created to draft a European Convention on Human Rights. A European Convention that this time would be a binding convention. Actually, it would be the first binding convention on human rights with an international scope in history. So this European Convention on Human Rights was actually created within the legal framework of an organization called the Council of Europe, created in 1949, and became binding in turn for the member states of the Council of Europe. It also paved the way for the creation of the first supranational judicial authority on human rights, the European Court of Human Rights, which was established on the 21st of January 1959. If you want to read further on this historical process, I recommend you to read Marco Duranti's book The Conservative Human Rights Revolution, in which the author argues that the European Convention was developed by mainly conservative and Christian European federalists. That's why the book is called The Conservative Human Rights Revolution. However, most historians agree today on the idea that the real boom of international human rights happened rather in the 1960s and 70s, thanks to the rise of human rights groups, of activism, or of transnational groups for international solidarity, such as Amnesty International, created in 1961, or Helsinki Watch, which was the mother organization for Human Rights Watch, created in 1977, among many others. This is a period that many historians referred to today as the period of the human rights breakthrough or the human rights revolution. This idea of a human rights breakthrough in the 1970s especially was developed first by Samuel Moyn in his book The Last Utopia, published in 2010. About European integration, it is important to acknowledge that the history of European integration does not only concern the European Union and its predecessor, the European communities. In fact, in the 1950s, the European communities were somewhat some organizations among many organizations created in the late 1940s and in the 50s for European cooperation. And so the history of European integration also encompasses all of those organizations, such as, for instance, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, created in 1948 for economic reconstruction, especially with the aim to manage the US financial aids within the so-called Marshall Plan. This is a poster of the Marshall Plan. This is a poster of propaganda for the Marshall Plan, a very well-known image in which we can read the motto, "Whatever the weather, we only reach welfare together." Then also the Council of Europe that I have already mentioned, created in 1949 for political cooperation and human rights, happened to be an important organization for European cooperation or integration. The Council of Europe was the outcome of a congress held in the Dutch city of The Hague in May 1948 by groups of European federalists, by, for instance, the European Movement and other groups of European federalism. And it was closely linked for that reason to those federalist movements. And for that reason too, it awoke some mistrust by some government members that were not so inclined to European federalism. However, the Council of Europe, although it did not develop a very high political authority, it became paramount as the organization for human rights cooperation, because it brought about the legal framework for the European Convention on Human Rights and later for the establishment of the European Court of Human Rights. The NATO was also, or can also be encompassed within these organizations for European integration, in this case for military cooperation with the United States in the context of the rising Cold War. Then the European Coal and Steel Community, the first European community set up in 1951, was created for cooperation in industrial production in a way to replace the International Authority for the Ruhr that had been created in April 1949 in the context of the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. Also, the West European Union was created for military cooperation in 1955, as well as to provide with a European background for the rearmament of the Federal Republic of Germany after the failure of another project, the European Defense Community, in the context of the end of military occupation in Germany. So, if you want to have further insight on European integration at its first stages, I recommend you to read Kieran Klaus Patel's book Project Europe: A History. In this logic, the European Economic Community, which is in many ways the legal predecessor of the European Union today, was created as another European organization, in this case for the creation of a customs union based on a common market and a common agricultural policy. Nevertheless, the EEC very soon became the protagonist and the vector of European integration, because it had a key supranational power, initially exclusively economic in nature, but very quickly with a recognized potential for political development. Historians also use the term the European Community in singular to refer at the same time to the EEC, the European Coal and Steel Community, and the Third European Community, namely Euratom, because the coming into power of the so-called merger treaty signed by the members of the communities in 1967 set a common legal background for the three communities. And so, especially from 1977 onwards, historians usually speak of the European Community in singular too. Let's take a look at Southern dictatorship. So, during the Cold War period, there existed three far-right authoritarian regimes based on military rule in three Southern European countries, namely Portugal, Spain, and Greece. These three dictatorships shared some common features. They were ultra-nationalistic dictatorships that relied on the reactionary ideology of traditionalism and which promoted geographical expansion through colonial empires or irredentism. They were identified with a radical interpretation of Christianism and were essentially against progressive modernity as well as fiercely anti-communist. Also, these three dictatorships owed much to the interwar fascism, especially to the Italian fascism, from which they all inherited the cult of personality and a socio-political organization based on corporatism and a single party. The dictatorship in Portugal is best known as the Estado Novo regime, and it was the oldest since it was established in 1926. The Estado Novo evolved from military rule at the very beginning of the dictatorship to a civilian authoritarianism under the rule of a dictator, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who ruled the country from 1933 to 1968. Salazar was indeed the main responsible for the ideological nature of the so-called Estado Novo. In its geopolitical stance, Portugal and the Estado Novo focused on the Atlantic Ocean and not so much on continental Europe, through colonialism and partnership with Anglo-Saxon countries, especially with Britain, that was Portugal's main historical ally. Dictatorial Portugal was a neutral country during World War II, even though it was more inclined to the cause of the Allies. Salazar lent the Azores waters for intelligence operations to the Allies, and so, after the war, Portugal quickly became a recognized ally in the Western Bloc. Portugal was a founding member of the NATO, and in 1960 it would also be a founding member of the European Free Trade Association, the EFTA. As you can see in the map, Portugal was more concerned by its Atlantic dimension and especially by its colonial empire that you can see in red, marked in red in the map. The dictatorship in Spain was a somewhat totalitarian regime under the rule of General Francisco Franco, whose troops had won the Spanish Civil War in 1939. So in Spain, the power of the dictatorship ruled by Franco was asserted by means of violence, and so state violence and repressions remained at the core of the dictatorial power for all the for all of its duration. Franco had won the war in part thanks to the intervention of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and so he supported the Axis during World War II. Spain did not directly intervene in World War II, but was not a neutral country either. Franco declared Spain a non-belligerent country and did not hide his sympathies for the cause of the Axis. For that reason, Spain became a pariah in the post-war international relations. Spain was isolated. Most countries in the world suspended their trade and diplomatic relations with Madrid. Spain was excluded from the early configuration of the United Nations, did not receive Marshall Plan aid, and was not a member of the NATO. However, this situation of pariah did not last for a long time. In the 1950s, Spain became a reliable ally in the Cold War for the West, and so it was progressively admitted in the organizations and networks of Cold War cooperation of Western cooperation in the framework of the Cold War. Also, from an economic point of view, Spain evolved during the Franco's year from a regime of autarky to economic liberalization and development based on foreign trades, international tourism, and immigrated labor. And this evolution led the dictatorship to a will of economic cooperation with Western European countries, which were their main commercial partners, especially from the 1950s onwards. Spain became a member of the United Nations in 1955 and was even admitted to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1961. In Greece, during the first years of the Cold War, during the early stages of the Cold War, there was a parliamentary monarchy, which had been asserted through a traumatic civil war that took place from 1946 to 1949, but which was swiped away by a military putsch on the 21st of April 1967, led by a group of colonels. This is important because the military junta that the coup d'etat established in Greece was led by lower rank militaries, by colonels and not generals. So the colonels' coup d'etat established a military junta presided by Colonel Yorgos Papadopoulos, who was also called at the time the Greek Franco, and who ruled the country from the coup d'etat until 1973. At the time of the coup d'etat, Greece was a member of NATO and the Council of Europe, and it was also the only associated country to the European Economic Community in Europe. It had a very close partnership with the EEC. Also, the junta set a regime of terror based on repression and famous for its use of torture practices in a permanent state of martial law. The colonels justified their seizure of power by a reactionary program of moral purification. And so the international community was then caught in a geopolitical trap, in which criticism to the new Greek regime might hinder the geopolitical interest in this key area of the Mediterranean, a geopolitical key area for the NATO, for the Cold War, and for the Middle East conflicts. And so, even the colonials Greece went through some form of geopolitical isolation, this remained quite mild and soft. Finally, we'll use 1949 and 1977 as the chronological milestones for our lecture. Why? Because 1949 coincides with the foundation of the Council of Europe, of which Greece was a founding member, and of the NATO, of which Portugal was a founding member and that Greece joined in 1952. And 1977 because that's the year of the European Community Common Declaration on Fundamental Rights, a document that I proposed you to read to prepare today's lecture. Also 1977 is, for the record, the year that Samuel Moyn identified with the human rights breakthrough, especially in his book The Last Utopia. So, the relations with these dictatorships contributed to the development of a political conditionality for European integration beyond the East-West divide, and subsequently influenced the assertion of human rights as a core element in the nature of the process. I propose you to see next why and how. Starting with Spain. Franco Spain requested in February 1962 an association to the European Economic Community in the fashion of a previous association of the European Economic Community with Greece. As a matter of fact, the EEC had signed an association agreement with Greece some months before, in 1961, which created a customs union with Greece with the intention of preparing the country for further membership. So the association with Greece was conceived as a first step towards full membership, and that's what the Spanish request of February 1962 sought. And so the Spanish request of 1962, which was also recalled in 1964, it opened a debate on whether a dictatorship should be a member of the common market. Many actors opposed at the time to this idea, among whom political personalities, but also political parties, transnational trade unions, etc. But nevertheless, some other prominent actors were in favor of the idea of inviting Spain to join the common market. That was the case of the French and German governments of the time. The French government led by Charles de Gaulle and the German government led then by Konrad Adenauer. Finally, a middle way was taken. In July 1964, the European Economic Community accepted to open exploratory talks with Spain without committing to a specific form of agreement. And so, in December 1966, the European Economic Community opened formal negotiations with the Spanish government. Nevertheless, by that time, in 1966, the possibility of the association seemed rather unlikely. In the end, an agreement called preferential was signed with Spain on the 29th of June 1970. So these negotiations with Spain, they are important because they introduced the idea that a European partner should meet some basic political conditions in order to negotiate with the community. It should be a democracy in the fashion of the Western pluralistic democracies, and it should somewhat respect the rule of law and basic rights. We may say that these negotiations set the ground or introduce the principle of what is called today ex ante political conditionality, meaning the exigence of previous political conditions in order to fulfill an agreement with a third country. In Greece, as I said before, the situation that the colonel's coup d'etat provoked in April 1967 created some embarrassment for the European partners too, because Greece was at the time a member of the Council of Europe and of the NATO as well, and it was the main partner in Europe for the European Economic Community at the time, because of the association agreement signed in 1961. And so the question of how to deal with dictatorial Greece became key at the time. Should Greece be ousted from the inter-European organizations? That was the question at stake at that moment. And so, in the right aftermath of the coup d'etat, debates on whether Greece should be expelled from the Council of Europe first, and then on whether Greece should be suspended, or on whether the Greek association to the EEC should be suspended, arised in both the Council of Europe and the EEC. These debates were firstly conveyed by the members of the parliamentary assemblies of both organizations, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the so-called PACE first, and then by the members of the European Parliament to the European Community. And so, in June 1967, the EEC eventually decided to freeze its association agreement with Greece. To freeze, what did this mean? Well, it simply meant that the functioning of the agreement would remain as business as usual, but that no implementation of the articles that had not been developed yet would not be possible. So, in other words, the idea was to maintain the status quo of the relations with Greece without implementing the association agreement, without implementing articles concerning areas such as, for instance, the free circulation of commodities, workers, etc. So the freeze of the association agreement with Greece was more a symbolic measure than was particularly a symbolic measure. Its most important impact was that no new financial aid by the European Investment Bank would be granted to Greece. Greece received indeed at the time financial aid from the European Investment Bank, despite not being a member of the European Economic Community, and the European Community decided to grant the funds that were due according to the program previously agreed with Greece, but not to negotiate new funding after the end of this program. The program of funding was foreseen to end in September 1967, and so after September 1977, Greece did not receive any more financial aid from the European Investment Bank as a result of freezing the association agreement. Also, the Council of Europe decided to open a case at the European Commission of Human Rights on the allegations of human rights abuse by the colonial regime. It decided to analyze whether Greece was breaching and violating the European Convention on Human Rights. And so, the so-called Greek case opened at the European Commission of Human Rights. This is a symbolic historical event because this Greek case, which lasted from September 1967 to October 1969, so for the first time since the post-war, dozens of people, victims of torture, witnesses, members of the Greek security forces or activists, testifying in front of an international jury. In the end, the Greek case resulted in a report on Greece, which happened to be very negative with regard to the colonials. The report of the Greek case established that the colonials regime was violating in a systematic way many of the articles of the European Convention on Human Rights, especially those regarding torture or fundamental freedoms. On the ground of this report, the other governments of the Council of Europe showed keen on suspending the membership of Greece to the Council of Europe. In other words, the other governments of the Council of Europe showed their will to expel Greece from the Council of Europe. However, this did not actually happen because the colonials surged ahead, as they announced that Greece would withdraw from the Council of Europe as at its own will before the other countries, before the other governments had the possibility to gather to take the final decision, which happened in December 1969. So, as a result of the Greek case, Greece withdrew from the Council of Europe after the other member states considered its expulsion from the organization. And so, this Greek withdrawal from the Council of Europe represents even today, still today, a single case in history. Then we may say that both the European Economic Community freeze of the association agreement with Greece and the exclusion of Greece from the Council of Europe following the Greek case represent groundbreaking cases of sanctions and suspensions based on human rights in the process of European integration. In the case of the European Community, it established a pattern of sanctions for those countries that did not comply with fundamental rights, and in the case of the Council of Europe, it brought about jurisprudence for the procedure of exclusion of a country that was never actually put in practice after 1969, but which was considered with regard to Turkey in the 1980s and which still remains today quite vivid in the debates of the organization. The case of Portugal is the last that we'll tackle for a very simple reason, because Portugal showed a faint interest on the European Economic Community and on the process of European integration as a whole beyond NATO and the EFTA. Portugal, as I said before, during its dictatorial period, was much centered on its Atlantic policies and on its colonies. Nevertheless, in 1962, Portugal sent a first request of negotiation with the European Economic Community, which in practice followed the British and Irish request of membership and aimed to create a convenient framework of trade for Portugal in the eventuality of a British and Irish accession to the European Community. However, as you know, no negotiation with Britain or Ireland was open at the time because of the de Gaulle's veto of 1963, and so the Portuguese request was not even considered at the time. In May 1970, Portugal requested for a second time negotiations with the EEC. Here, in the context of the recast of relations between the EFTA and the EEC, once again because the United Kingdom and along with it Ireland, Denmark and Norway had requested negotiations for accession to the European Economic Community. In this case, Portugal did not seek any form of association, unlike Franco's Spain. It only wanted to recast its trade relations in the context of an enlarged European community and in the context of implementing or fostering an EFTA-EEC partnership. And so, in July 1970, only 2 months after the request, the European Community opened negotiations with all EFTA members which were not the candidates for EEC membership, including Portugal. These negotiations encountered some minor political resistance because of the political nature of the Portuguese regime, coming especially from trade unions and even from the Dutch government. However, Portugal negotiated along with the other EFTA members with the European Community and eventually signed a trade agreement in July 1972, similar to the other agreements signed at the same time by its EFTA fellows. Even if the Portuguese negotiations encountered some opposition, at the time the EEC had already shown that it would go no further than the boundaries that had already been set by the Spanish and Greek relations in the previous years. And so, after the Portuguese negotiation, we may say that these experiences set the grounds to the way European integration organizations would tackle with these countries after the end of dictatorial rule. As you probably know, the dictatorships of these three countries came to an end in the mid-70s. In Portugal, the dictatorship fell when a revolutionary movement triggered by low-rank army officials, known as the Carnation Revolution, put an end to the Estado Novo in April 1974 and opened a 2-year democratic transition which would be marked by social tensions as well as by the end of the Portuguese colonial empire, the dismantlement of the Portuguese colonial empire. In Greece, the colonial's regime forced a coup d'etat in Cyprus, a foreign country to Greece, in July 1974, and this coup d'etat provoked a reaction by Turkey, which occupied the northern part of the island, the north of Cyprus. So this Turkish military occupation of North Cyprus proved the colonial's attempt to change the status quo in Cyprus to be a fiasco. And after this fiasco, the high-rank militaries, the major state of Greece and the Greek generals decided to finally hand the power to a civilian government. A civilian government that received the mission of restoring democracy, and that would be led by the charismatic politician Konstantinos Karamanlis. In Spain, the dictatorship ended in a smoother way. Franco died of old age in November 1975, and it was under the rule of his appointed heir, the King Juan Carlos I, who started his reign as an almighty king designed by Franco, that, however, the democratic transition was started out. More concretely, a referendum for political reform in December 1976 triggered a 2-year democratic transition in Spain. In this context, as I said, it seemed clear that pluralistic democracy was a sine qua non condition for full participation into European integration, especially in the case of European community. And so, we may say that those experiences in dealing with dictatorial Spain, Greece and Portugal in the 60s and in the first years of the 1970s set the basis to democratic conditionality for enlargement, meaning that only consolidated pluralistic democracies fashioned in the way of Northwestern parliamentary democracies could seek for accession to the European community. During their respective democratic transition processes, the three countries sought indeed for membership to both the Council of Europe and the European Community. And in this context, a new practice was set in motion. The accession to the Council of Europe functioned as a means to legitimize the new democracies and pave the way to open negotiations for membership to the European community. And so, Greece was readmitted in the Council of Europe in November 1974, which legitimized, in a way, its democratic transition process in the making, and which paved the way for the opening of negotiations with Greece after a formal request introduced on the 12th of June 1975, resulting in the full membership of Greece to the European community beginning from the 1st of January 1981 onwards. The same pattern was repeated in the case of Portugal, which was admitted for the first time to the Council of Europe on the 22nd of September 1976, and which requested membership to the European Community on the 28th of March 1977, and so it was also repeated in the case of Spain, which was accepted to the Council of Europe on the 24th of November 1977 and which requested membership to the European Community in July 1977. Both Iberian countries, Portugal and Spain, became respectively the 11th and 12th members of the European Community on the 1st of January 1986. Quid pro quo, we may also say that this process also contributed to the consolidation of the European Community's democratic nature as one identified with fundamental rights. Actually, the term fundamental rights is the term preferred in the context of the European Community and today the European Union ever since. in EU law, the term fundamental rights is usually preferred to the term human rights. And this is a practice established especially in the 1970s. As you probably know, the Charter, the Convention, so to speak, on Human Rights of the European Union is called the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, issued in the year 2000. So, as I was saying, human rights and democratic nature became major concerns for the European community, at least in the rhetoric of the community and its general debates on the evolution, on the political evolution of the community in the 1970s. The term fundamental rights was introduced into international law for the first time in a series of decisions taken by the European Court of Justice of Luxembourg, the first one in 1969. The question of a European identity was apparent in a declaration on European identity issued by the Summit of Copenhagen of the 14th December 1973. And then, on the 5th of April 1977, the respective presidents of the European Parliament, the Commission and the Council of Ministers co-signed the Common Declaration on Fundamental Rights that I propose you to read prior to this lecture, in which they stated that fundamental rights, they constitute the basis of the European Community's legal framework. Finally, a declaration on democracy issued by the European Council held in Copenhagen in April 1978 paved the way for the first election by universal suffrage to the European Parliament held in June 1979. So the Common Declaration on Fundamental Rights in April 1977 represents our concluding milestone in terms of chronology. This is the text that I hope you have already read and that states that in the exercise of the powers and in pursuance of the aims of the European communities, the European Parliament, the Council and the Commission respect and will continue to respect fundamental rights as the ones derived from the European Convention on Human Rights. So, to conclude, we may state that the equation European integration equal European community equal democracy and human rights does not seem so obvious in historical perspective. This is an equation taken for granted in the rhetoric of the European Union even today, that considers that European integration is only about the European Union and the European community, also in historical perspective, and that also esteems that human rights had been apparent in the European community political nature since the very foundation of the communities. So we may say that this type of official discourses do not always match the historical records, which happen to be more complex than we might think at first. The political dimension of European integration has indeed been built up throughout time, according to several factors such as geopolitical configurations, diplomacy, or even the economic necessities of the common market at the different periods of its evolution. There is a historical continuity between Southern enlargement in the 1970s and 80s and Eastern enlargement in the 90s and 2000s, because the principles and the practices fostered with regard to Southern enlargement were officially encoded with regard to Eastern enlargement. And so, as I said, the South and the East represent the two main chapters in the book of human rights assertion in European integration. Also, another concluding remark is that there is a historical irony in the switch of roles between the European Union and the Council of Europe in the recent years. The European Union best represents today the key bearer of human rights. The champion of human rights in inter-European relations is today more than anyone the European Union, with its foreign policy, with its external action, as well as with its Charter for Fundamental Rights and with the ruling of its Court of Justice. Whereas the Council of Europe, which was supposed to have the main role in the implementation of human rights in an inter-European context, it struggles today with some of its members whose compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights does not seem very obvious at all. That is the case of some of its biggest members, such as Russia and Turkey, but also of some other members, such as Azerbaijan.